All right. Hello, everybody. I am Martha Hines, and I am here today. So happy, so looking forward to this conversation with Chris Skidmore. And we have a really interesting conversation I think we're about to have, which I wasn't planning for. And it came out of a conversation that Chris and I had about a week ago, pretty organically, it just arose in the conversation. And Chris suggested we do this video. And so I'll just give you a little bit of background on what this topic is and why we're here. And then I'll turn it over to Chris to give your side of why we're here. But so as many of you know, I recently hosted the Rebecoming the One 2023 symposium, which was a month-long symposium, which is still available, totally free. You're very welcome to sign up for it. I will put the link in this video. But the focus of the symposium was to hold space and conversations around healing of our relationships to gender and sexuality. And it was held over the whole month of June 2023. And each week of the month had a different theme. And Chris was a speaker in the very beginning of the symposium, where we had a conversation where we talked about Asclepius and other healing, like a perspective on healing in the world through mythology and et cetera, et cetera. And I highly recommend that conversation too, for sure. But then later in the symposium, moving more into it, then I had there was a week that was on devoted to the divine feminine, then a week devoted to the divine masculine, a week devoted to the divine person and the non-binary and gender fluidity and conversations like that. And then a final week that brought everything together and back to the theme of rebecoming the one. So Chris and I got together last week, and Chris asked me how that symposium was for me. And I gave him a pretty honest answer, which was that it was beautiful and wonderful and, overall really great, tons of amazing feedback. And that the one real challenge I had was around the week of the divine masculine. And the reasons for that were multi-layered, but what was also interesting to me and that I expressed to Chris was that the feedback I also got from participants was pretty much universally glowingly happy for almost the entire symposium, except also for the divine masculine week. So, there's so many layers to all of this, and that's what we're going to dive into in this conversation. But when Chris and I really went into some of the nuances of why that might have been and, what that was about, both personally for me, but also on a really more importantly, on a collective level, Chris had some beautiful insights that I hadn't thought of, that hadn't arose in the symposium itself. And so I think we both felt like this would be a beautiful opportunity to both bring the symposium, kind of give the symposium like was that an epilogue? Is that the right word? Or like a post scene something or other. And also just to, take the conversation another step further, because obviously this conversation probably won't ever end, not in our lifetimes, I don't think. And so maybe this is bringing it to the next step on various levels. And yeah, so I'm just excited to dive into whatever is wanting to be explored here. And I'm really grateful, Chris, that you even suggested this conversation. And thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for for the connection that we're having together and for the things we're exploring. And I mean, we've only really talked, I think this is our 4th time or something, in a few emails and things, but there's definitely a lot of synchronicities and some interesting stuff that we can explore, I believe. And yeah, I remember from our conversation last week that it's part of my training as a process-oriented psychotherapist. And what that means is, in essence, it's a way of saying yes to the things that are emerging, which sounds pretty simple, but it's actually not so simple. It's kind of a difficult proposition a lot of the time, because usually we're in the state of mind of like, oh, I like this thing that's happening, but I don't like that thing that's happening, right? So I'm going to lean towards that thing that's happening because that's really good, and I'm going to try to get away from that thing that's happening because I don't like it very much. And so actually, when you start to look at the world through this process-oriented lens, which is all, if people want to know more about that, there's Arnold and his wife Amy Mindell from Portland, Oregon, which is this, Jungian / he was also a theoretical physicist that then went and became a Jungian, and then realized that the body wasn't so involved in Jungian thought, so brought in the body. And it's a really fascinating sort of set of principles for understanding reality in a way. But what was going on, I felt, was when you were talking about the divine masculine week, I was like, oh, this is the thing that you wanted to talk about was arising as you were talking about it. Melanie Reinhardt calls that a metalogue. It's a big part of her sort of way of seeing the world too, right? Like, oh, the thing that we're talking about is arising as we're talking about it. And what I could sense is that the discomfort around actually having good, healthy conversations about masculinity was arising as, or troublesome parts of masculinity, we could say, was arising as you decided to talk about the divine masculine. And I sort of felt that was all very perfect in a way. And then how to sort of bring it in, rather than cast it out, which I think is the ultimate question. How do we bring it in rather than cast it out? How do we separate out toxicity from masculinity so we can actually talk about it? And then how do we allow masculinity to be poly and multiple, because there's many, many different kinds of it in the world that are observable? And how do we begin to firstly separate it from its toxic association, that it's sort of like, I bet if you just put it to the consensus reality, the word masculine, you might get bounced back the word toxic. And that's not a really good way to start, because that feels like we've already cast it out of the conversation, and then we want to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
So I think what came up for me is Eris, who's in the I guess she's kind of a dwarf planet. Eris is in, because she has a 555-year orbit of the sun, she's not going very fast. So she's been in Aries for all of our lifetimes, give or take. I think probably most people here have Eris in Aries. So you can feel how long that process is. And, the character of Eris in Greek mythology was not invited to the big banquet where all the goddesses and gods were. She wasn't invited. And she wasn't invited because her name means strife, discord, and she's the sister of Eris, the god of war. So she's not invited to the banquet, which you can understand. You don't want to invite strife to your party, right? Who would want to do that? But because she wasn't invited, she does a very small thing, gets a golden apple and writes on the golden apple for the fairest and throws it into the banquet. And that small act of taking the innocence of a golden apple and just writing something about love on it, it's a very Aphroditic, it's a very Venusian thing, throws it into the party, and that starts a battle of which of the goddesses are the fairest, which starts a beauty contest judged by Paris, which starts the Trojan War, just to put it in a really small, just to put it in a sequence. So in the end, by not inviting Eris to the party, a 10-year war happens of enormous amounts of destruction and strife. And all that Eris needed to do was something very small, just throw a little concept into the, throw the innocent apple into the party and walk away. So my sense was like, something's not being invited into the party here. And we're looking downstream and trying to take care of like all the other things, like things that are toxic. We're trying to deal with those. but we're not getting back to the root of like what conversation are we trying to have. I think that's what I'm interested in as a starting point.
Yeah.
What
And
conversation are we trying to have here? Yeah,
absolutely. Would you feel comfortable also just kind of backing up? Because
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, one thing that I thought was so profound about your suggestion that we have this conversation was also, I know a little bit about your chart, right? So, or I know your chart, and I've seen your chart, and I know that your Mars squares your nodes,
Yeah,
um, and your Mars happens to be on my midheaven. So it's
yeah,
like, here we are having a conversation on YouTube about the divine masculine. It's kind
yeah,
of so for you, I'm curious to hear on a personal level why something arose in you that you suggested this conversation, and that came
yeah,
from somewhere deep in you. That's my sense, at least. It wasn't just an
yeah.
intellectual interest.
No,
Do you want to speak to that?
yeah, for sure. So, well, for the audience that know astrology, my Mars is in Gemini, and it's exactly on my descendant, and it squares my nodal story, which is South Node Pisces, North Node Virgo. Um, and so, and that North Node has Saturn with it. So I actually also have the Saturn Mars square. So you can get a sense that I was born with my own personal struggles with Mars, um, my own personal struggles with the masculine principle inside of myself, how it is in the world. I was born into an Australian family um, at a time at the very late 70s. Coming into the 80s was my sense of like, okay, so what is this masculine thing? And obviously the things that I get back from culture are sort of around, I mean, it was big into He-Man, so this big muscular heroic type. And then it was a time when Arnold Schwarzenegger was becoming big and Sylvester Stallone. And it's time of the big action hero, the big burly, muscly action hero, who's basically out to kill everybody that's not good, to put it bluntly. It's like there's good guys and bad guys, and if the good guys can just kill the bad guys, that's good. That's really great. And then there was this correction that happened in the 90s where I'm going through this culture where it's like, okay, that's celebrated, it seems. And then there's this huge correction that happens around about I'm coming into sort of 12, 13, 14. Big changes happen in my family of origin. My parents get split up. I leave a co-ed primary school and go to a single sex high school. I leave the church, which was Catholicism, and I don't really have a church in my high school. So all these changes happen when I'm basically 12 years old. And so we're talking kind of 1991, 92. So yeah, just to slow that down a bit. Right. So my parents split. I leave the co-ed school to go to a all boy school. So the girls are cast out of my world for 5 years, and it's just boys. And I don't have religion anymore because it's just like, oh, this school doesn't really do that thing that you just spent all this time like doing your confirmation and like taking it very seriously, this whole Catholicism thing. And now it's just not really here. I would still go to church on Sundays for a while, and then it just faded out. So in my own story, and then so I'm coming into adolescence around that, and I'm really asking questions at that point around what is it to be, like, now I'm surrounded just by boys. Okay, so what is it to be a boy? And the boys I'm around don't know. There's a lot of confusion amongst all of us. So there's hierarchies that start to happen like any school, and there's a little bit of bullying and teasing and this kind of stuff that starts to go on. And it all goes on in a context where there's just boys around and no women, no girls around. I'm not able to also see the other side of reality or to expand that. It's just with the boys now. And then, of course, in order to be popular at school, you got to be good at sports, and you got to do that, you know, you got to be funny, you got to be all these kinds of things. And there's this sense of like, how do you climb the social order of things, and all very complicated stuff in a way. And I think it just led me, because there was so much confusion and a little bit of chaos, you know, my Pisces South Node had kicked in, right? Like, and I've gone into the big chaos of it all. And I'm like, okay, what, you know, what do we do? And in Australia, to be a man is to be kind of stoic and to be not very emotional and to be all of those kinds of things, because that's what that culture puts forward, or was at the time putting forward. But then the 90s brought in this whole new thing of like the sensitive new age guy thing, right? And so I'm kind of now being raised by women on the one hand, because my dad is doing his own process of the divorce, and but at schools with all boys on the other hand, and the culture saying like, actually, we're kind of done with the 80s style of man. Here's a different kind of man that you might want to be interested in. He's sensitive and emotionally available, but he seems to be this caricature of more like a woman man now, right? Like more like a feminine man classically. And these are all even terms now that I think are so much more complicated now in my adult mind, as my 44-year-old self wrestles with this in a whole different way. But my younger self didn't know how to wrestle with this, apart from with the images given to me by the culture and my own personal experiences. So I always found it really complicated. I knew I wanted to grow as a man and become a man, but I wasn't really sure exactly what that was to do that. And I think that's still the case. Like, there's a sense of wanting to grow and become as a man for boys going into manhood. But even more so today, there's a real hazing and confusion around like, what does that even mean? So I guess that gives you a bit of a sense of my personal story in a nutshell, of what I personally have in my own, I guess, my own Mars myth, I would call it, because I like to think of each of the planets of having their own myth throughout your story. And you can maybe sense that mine's in Gemini and squaring that nodal story of Pisces, Virgo, and opposite of Sagittarius rising and opposite Neptune, if you want to bring that in as well.
And where
Yeah.
would you say you are now with the where, however you want to, I mean, that's an optional question, of course, but all of these questions are optional. Where is Chris now in the journey of the Mars myth?
I'm very much inside of myself. I feel I have made it into a journey in my life, and I think I've swung in some times in my life way towards the more feminine side of this equation, and then swung way back to the more masculine side. And now I feel very much kind of like at home in my masculinity, personally, which I don't see as any form of machoism or anything like that. That just seems like a really old, outdated concept and idea. But I do feel like there's an essence of masculinity that's super important to, and that I feel is really, there's a deep longing for people in the world, right? So I feel it, that there's a missing component that, and this doesn't really matter whether male, female, trans, whatever. It's just like we're all, we're all in the soup of all of that. We all have a Mars, we all have a Venus. So on that side, there's that. But how to separate the conversation into masculine, feminine, and then male, female, man, woman, it's like complicated even to make those distinctions. But I must say that I am particularly attuned to, for whatever reason, the struggle of boys and the struggle of men. And I see how so many men are actually really deep thinkers and feelers, but they're not allowed to express themselves in such a way. And so they maintain a real surface presentation. And that makes me really sad. And I want to be able to help. Like a huge part of what I see is important is rites of passage, and the ability to go from one phase of life to another, which helps with the process of individuation, which helps make healthy adults in this world. And healthy adults can then mentor children through things. And I think we've just lost so much of that because we've lost so many of the rituals and the ceremonies of life. And so personally, my journey took me back through history, and then observing, ancient Greek in particular times, and what seems to me to be a really cool set of rituals that are there. So we don't necessarily have to go either to the Amazon or to tribal cultures or indigenous cultures or over to the East. Actually, within the West, which I am part of and proud to be a part of, there is already in our history and in our ancestry really good technologies for this. They just need a little dusting off, and they can be hard to discover because there's 2,000 plus years of stuff that tells us not to look at that anymore. But the more I look at it, it's like, oh no, we had it. We definitely had plenty of, I would call like indigeneity in our ancestral roots, and not that long ago.
Yeah. And I kind of mentioned this to you in the conversation we had last week. I can't remember to what extent I did, but it's a rising, so I'll say it again. I and I mentioned this in the symposium a few times. I 5 years ago in April 2018, I was a social worker doing a very three-dimensional job, if you want to put it that way, intense, all of that. And I had this experience I was not expecting of 8 spirits came to me and told me I needed to start, I was going to need to leave social work, and I was going to start channeling a series of 8 books. I had never channeled before. Again, I was in this very 3D, it was a very not expected experience. Okay. So since then I did leave social work. I channeled the first 3 of those 8 books, published those a few years ago. And then this symposium was very, very clearly, definitely related to the second set of 3 of those 8 books, which are called Love Speaks, The Goddesses Speak, and The Gods Speak. And I channeled the first draft of Love Speaks, which is about inner sacred union, essentially, in early 2020. And then I channeled the first 3 quarters of The Goddesses Speak in the summer of 2020, so 3 years ago. And I haven't started The Gods Speak. And so I think there are many layers to why and what that's about. But part of what I think my soul, in order to be ready to be a channel for The Gods Speak, I've needed to go through my own journey with the masculine, the divine masculine, my inner masculine, my relationship, my karma with the masculine, all of it. And I have my Venus in Eris on my south node conjunct Chiron. So I have Venus, my south node, and Chiron all conjunct in Eris.
Wow.
In my 8th house, right? So a little bit intense.
Well, and so crazy because before getting on the call, we were like, hey, when did Chiron go into Aries? And it's like, oh, April 2018. And then you literally just like, oh, this is very chironic, isn't it?
I know, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And I also recently discovered that my natal Shiva asteroid is at 0 Taurus, where the north node was just sitting until Monday.
Yeah.
And as we're making this video, I just noticed that the transiting Shiva asteroid is at 25 Cancer, which is opposite Pluto, where, anyway, yes, there's so many things going on. And Chiron is going retrograde in the next 10 hours as we're recording this.
And Venus retrograde
and
as
Venus
well.
just went retrograde today.
Yeah.
Trining my Chiron and my south node, and
right.
Anyway, But so two layers to this for me. One is, I think over the last 5 years, I think I've been doing two things at the same time in my own journey with the divine feminine, the divine masculine. One is I've clearly needed to move through a lot of my own karma with it all. Like my dad died last December, and that really put my processing of my karmic patterns on turbocharge over the last few months in a really beautiful way. I mean, really, like, I'm very grateful, actually. But the other part of it has been this question I've just been holding, which is, what is the masculine and what is the divine masculine, right? If I'm, for me, channeling the goddesses speak was easy. So it was right there. I didn't need to prepare. I mean, I read a whole bazillion books on goddesses around the world, and, but to be a channel for that, I have Venus on my south node. Like, I'm built to do that. It's fine.
Yeah.
For me to be a channel for the gods speak.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm only barely now at a place where I'm almost ready. And meeting you, I think, among other things, I think on a personal level, one thing I can feel in the potential of it is that I think your relationship to what you were just talking about with the with the Roman and Greek archetypes, and with even just the sanctity of the Greek history, has brought in an element, even with just a few conversations we've had, has brought in this new element for me of tapping into something I can't even name yet, around like this. I just feel it as this glowing kind of golden light around these archetypes that I could only struggle with, right? Like Zeus, for example, right? Or Mars, or whatever it is. Their archetypes and their stories have so much strife in them and so much trauma, or that's one lens. And then I feel like we met through Melanie Reinhardt, right? So I feel like, and it felt very divinely guided. So I feel like for me, on one level, part of that divine guidance, I think, we'll see what happens over the next few years or whenever, but I think it's partly the spirit world, giving me something I needed, or I do need, to somehow transmute something in myself to be a channel for that book, right? And then similarly, I think that your work and the way you are, from what I know of you, just gives that to the world in general. So I'm just naming all of these layers there. And I don't know if that sparks anything in you that you want to respond to, but
the sort of image that I get of what you're staring at there is like, I think we talked about it, of there's a real resistance to go into Greek mythology and Roman mythology. It's the same thing, give or take. And that's understandable, because with something like Greek mythology, you can look at it and you can cherry pick from it, because it's too complex to understand at a cursory glance. And it's taken me many, many years, and I'm going to say decades actually, to even really be able to enter the pool and have a swim around and know what I'm talking about at all. A long, long time. So if you're just skimming because you've got lots of other things to know, right? And if you're just skimming it, you may just skim something like the Pandora story. And Pandora is introduced to a world that's all men until Pandora enters. So you may see that story and you may say, well, it's misogynist. And so then you may extract from that and go like, or extrapolate from that and say, Greek mythology is misogynist, And actually it's like, well, I get the resistance, because terrible things are done by men in Greek mythology. But what we don't see then is that terrible things are done by women too, which is why it's so awesome, actually, because it's like, what it offers, let me just go back to the more personal of how it's been healing for me. Because as I said to you, I was raised in a Catholic church. I was an altar boy in the church. I got first communion and I went through the confirmation and all of that before it just disappeared out of my life. But that's what I did. That's what it did. So my whole sort of first 12 years had that element very strongly there. Church every Sunday, midnight masses on and Christmas, and very, very there, wearing the white robes as the altar boy. And so as a training, that was a sense that there's a really good guy, that's God, and there's an equally bad guy, that's the devil. And then that's how to really orient reality. And you try to be as good as you can. And if you're really good, you go to heaven. And if you fail at being really, really good, you go to hell. I'm summarizing it, but I did pick this information up as a child. So I received it as a child, and it's still there in my child, right? Now, Greek mythology, that ultimate good guy, supposedly, it's Zeus. That's the God guy. And anybody that knows even a little bit about Greek mythology knows that Zeus is, he's the king of the gods, but he's also a total scoundrel, right? He gets up to all sorts of trouble and no good. He's chasing the nymphs around and stuff. Anyone that takes his fancy, he just goes for them. That's not how you'd want your God to behave, right? And so then you look at okay, so who's the equivalent devil? Well, that's Hades / Pluto. And then you can see, he does, basically abduct Persephone. So that's a really bad act. But as a character, he's just God of the underworld. So he has a connection to soul and a connection to the death realm and a connection to helping souls go through the end of life passage and getting them ready for the next life. That's not a bad guy. He's not sitting there with the pitchfork and all flames and punishing people. That's definitely not who he is. And actually, he marries Persephone and they become equals in the underworld. And Zeus has his equivalent of Hera, who was clearly in the more matriarchal traditions of which Greek mythology springs from. She was the great goddess, right? Mm-hmm. Who links back to the earth goddesses before her, Rhea and Gaia, who are earth god. So then when you actually look, it's oh no, all of it's in there. It's just in the big soup. So once you break through those layers, you can see, you can't name for me an all good god or goddess, and you can't name for me an all bad god or goddess. And in that way, everybody becomes a little bit more ambiguous and a little bit more referencing the dilemmas at the heart of the soul, right? And so once I opened to that, it really healed. I'm going to say it really healed my religious wound. It did something for me. And it did something for me that, say, atheism or agnosticism wasn't able to do for me. Which is basically to say, there's some really bad stuff there. I'm just going to put it away. I couldn't do it. It meant too much for me. I needed to have faith in something beyond the self. And so I traveled back through Christianity, and just before Christianity, it's there they are, all these gods and goddesses in Rome. And then you travel back before them, and it's whoa, there they are in ancient Greece, and so that helped me to relieve certain dogmatic positions that are inevitable when you just have the one male god. It's inevitable to have really dogmatic positions. It doesn't matter how you spin it, you just end up there because you've only got that one god to go to, and he's male. So you've already left out the whole female element. That's gone, and then pretty much everyone ends up being in the devil, right? The devil is everything left over from being the one good sun god. And it's been healing. It's been immensely healing for me to discover that. And I kind of want to help bridge people over that. I want to help people to discover that, people that want to, and some don't, and I have to accept that, because it's fine in a way that some don't. But I think that when you hear some of these stories and you actually get the cults that were built up. There's another word that became dirty over time, right? But cults, which are mini religions that are dedicated to particular gods and goddesses. So you have a cult of Artemis, and you have a cult of Aphrodite, and you have a cult to Hera, and right, and you clearly have a cult to Demeter, and that's a major one of the whole story of Persephone and Demeter, which was the Eleusinian mysteries, a 9-day ritual. And who went through that 9-day ritual where you actually go and meet your death and come back? Plato, Socrates, Hippocrates, all of the thinkers that we know about today went through that incredible process and were sworn to secrecy and didn't talk about it because they took it as that sacred that they couldn't talk about it, which leaves us with very little information because it's sworn to secrecy. But we do know that they did a 9-day process that was held by priests and priestesses. They went through the Persephone Demeter story. They met their death. They basically had a initiation of meeting one's death and came back free in a way that there's no other way to be free in this life but to meet one's death. And it was done on a cultural level, not on an individual level, but a cultural level. If that doesn't move you, it's like, I don't know what to say. I'm moved by it. I feel an absence of it in my own life. And so when it comes to my masculinity, I'm like, nobody took me at 15, nobody did that. And it's missing. And so I am like Chiron in Eris, wounded. And the solace in that is like, so are so many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Just maybe
Yeah.
cool point here. I wanted to name one thing and then ask you a question.
Please.
So it seems like in our conversation last week, and then also what we've been talking about here, one of the big themes that seems to be present is this whole the importance of being conscious not to ostracize or polarize things in an unhealthy, unhelpful way. And I mean, I could go in so many different directions with that, but I just say when I was channeling the book Love Speaks, which again is about the inner sacred union of the masculine and feminine, one of the main points that was trying to be made in that book was that you can't ever not be one, right? So for example, at the end of the book, they talk about how let's say in an outer relationship, through the eyes of divine love. I'm not saying this is practical all the time, but this I'm just repeating what was said. Through the eyes of divine love in this sense is that we tend to have conversations with each other where, at least in my life, it's like, I am here, you are here. Yeah. I'm going to feel and name my needs. I will express them and articulate. That's my responsibility, is to articulate my needs to you. You do the same with me. We will jointly and separately see where we meet or don't. This is not bad, okay? But the difference in the framing of Love Speaks view was that's fine in the human context, but in the ultimate sense of the oneness and the divine, there's another perspective that just try this out, right? Like this is what they're saying in the book. Try out the idea that you are each other. And so each of your needs in a sense are part of the oneness. And so there's no getting away from each other in a sense, right? Even if in the human world, there's a need for boundaries and there's a need, there's a particularly not good dynamic and you do need to not see this person again or something. The reality is they don't actually disappear. Even if they die, they don't, nothing actually goes away because it's all part of the one. So again, that, I'm not taking that super literally. I'm just saying more on a metaphorical, but also literal level, but on a meta level, it's just this reminder to come back to the wholeness of things, that any polarity is maybe in one sense true, but ultimately not, or at least the polarity is is a reflection of the wholeness in its relationship to itself.
Yeah.
Right? Is that making sense?
It makes total sense. And what I hear in it is like, yeah, so back to Eris's story, if we exile a part, then it comes back and causes a lot more trouble than you imagine it would. And
Yeah.
very easily, just with
Yeah.
a golden apple. It's that simple. And I actually think, now listening to you talk just then, what occurred to me is something kind of new for me, actually, is that both Venus and Mars are exiled at the moment.
Yes.
Right? Both of them are.
Oh my God.
So that's tricky when they're both
Mm-mm-mm.
exiled. So we're trying to discuss masculine and feminine without even recognizing that these two very essential elements of, let's say that, because there's multiple masculinities, multiple femininities, we get that, but two very essential elements, Mars, Venus, both in exile.
Whoa.
That's trouble, isn't it?
Hmm.
And they can't, like you said, like Love Speak says, it doesn't go away, but it can become monstrous.
Yes.
Right? So
yes.
because it's cast out,
Yes.
and if you just want to do a thought experiment of that, imagine that everybody in your community cast you out. Would
Which
you
has
just go
happened.
away?
I think that's
Right?
happened to a lot of us, and many, I could
A
say for
lot of
myself,
us.
that's happened in my past lives for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And so imagine, or even in this life for a lot of us.
Yeah, sure.
And so imagine what you do. Do you just kind of like go and meditate on a hill and realize that you're actually just still the one? Or do you become monstrous in you want to get back in, like Eris wants to get back in. And so how does she get back in? Well, she is strife. So she causes enormous strife. And now she's there, right? Because now she's back in. And so, yeah, any one of us listening, myself, yourself included, if we're cast out and just like left out in the cold, we'll do whatever it takes to get back in. We'll come back. We'll come back as a monstrous form. And take that as the metaphor for how Mars and Venus are cast out, and they can't be cast out. They are too essential to the human experience to just go away.
And I think one of the themes that came up in many of the conversations in Rebecoming the One, and particularly in the Divine Masculine Week talks, was this deep grief, both in men and women and people of all genders. But that's something that arose in me a lot during the week, was my own grief, and then the men also expressing a lot of their grief in a beautiful way, actually, in a really beautiful way. It's just a universal thing that we are extremely sad.
Yeah.
Right.
Because if you live without those two forces, you basically live without the libidinal force that Mars gives you, like the ability to act and the ability to go into the world and like really enjoy this place, just get out there and just be courageous and bold enough to go out and just do whatever it is that you feel is like, this is what I want to do in its healthiest form. It's so great. It's visionary and it's adventurous, and Mars is the first planet after Earth, right? So it's free and it helps you to be free. So the absence of that, okay, well, it may come out in its more monstrous forms, like then it becomes toxic. Then we can talk about the toxic side, because its beautiful side isn't embraced, so it becomes toxic. And then think of Venus not being invited. So your desires, your lust for life, your wanting to just taste all the deliciousness of this place, and just to be in one's body so beautifully in the body and really loving the body.
Yeah.
And if one's not allowed that, or if a community or a culture doesn't want that, okay, there'll be a lot of dissociation in that kind of a place. People start escaping to other realms. And then it'll come back in its monstrous forms.
Yeah.
And I'll leave you to imagine what they might be, but it's not hard to imagine.
Mm.
And so there's not a meeting of Mars and Venus, who in Greek mythology were Aphrodite and Eris, who had the child Eros and had the child Harmonia, right?
Mm.
So
Mhm.
they were really good together, those two. Were they married? No. Aphrodite was already married to Hephaestus, who's like the lame smith god. But because it was an arranged marriage, she doesn't want anything to do with it. So she got together with Adonis and, you know, all the beautiful ones. But she was particularly drawn to Mars, even though, or Ares, even though in Greek mythology, he was quite despised by Zeus himself. He was still invited in and cared for, despite being despised. I think that's, again, what Greek mythology can teach us, that other forms of religiosity that are more about moralistic lessons can't teach us. So the Greeks weren't trying to teach us morals. They were just trying to display and amplify the collective dreaming. And in the collective dreaming was life as we know it in all its weird complexities. And so if the gods and goddesses are struggling with this, it really helps us as individuals who struggle with this on much less pronounced ways, much less amplified ways.
So beautiful.
Yeah, so they can't meet because we're not honoring them. We don't have temples to them, and we need temples to them.
Yes. I'm having one more question. I feel like, you know, this could be a, I don't know, 100-part series or something.
Great, let's do it. But yes, for today.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do have one more question I would really love to ask you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So as we've already mentioned, as we're recording this, Chiron is stationed retrograde. It's going to go retrograde in the next 8 hours or something.
Yeah.
And over the course of the symposium, Mars and Venus almost came into a conjunction in Leo, but not quite, right?
So close.
So close, but not quite. And then, as I was telling you before we started recording, however, next February, I think it is, Mars and Venus will be conjunct. They will meet in Aquarius. So opposite where they almost were conjunct just last month. And I looked at the chart for when they're going to be conjunct, and when they're going to be conjunct is also exactly when the North Node in Aries will be conjunct Chiron. Like,
wow.
Holy camole, right? Like,
yeah.
And to throw in Shiva, the asteroid Shiva, at the same time will be on the South Node. So Shiva, I guess you could call it the divine masculine in a sense, will be on the South Node of the moon in Libra, while Chiron is on the North Node of the moon in Aries, and Venus and Mars finally actually come together in Aquarius.
Wow.
I don't even know, right?
I don't know either, but yeah, that's a beautiful set of images. That's for sure.
So my question for you is, as we're sitting on this sort of eve of Chiron going retrograde, and also then, you know, looking ahead to the fact that the new moon, the North Node of the moon is now in Aries, just barely, but it's heading toward Eris, and then Chiron, right? And then when it meets Chiron is when we'll have the Venus-Mars conjunction also. So it's a two-part question, actually. So, I'm just curious what arises for you in that, if anything, or how you could, I'm sure something arises, but whatever you want to share. But my real question I would love to close on then, I think, is, unless there's something else that you want to say, I'm wondering, what is your Chiron prayer, right? Like, we're in this moment, Chiron going retrograde and the North Node heading toward Eris and then Chiron. So I feel, and Chariklo actually is, going to be conjunct the full moon coming up in a couple of weeks. So there's this healing energy and potential in this time. At the same time, there's so much being stirred up, and Pluto squaring the nodes and you know, but this conversation to me feels deeply healing. And so I can just feel that kind of golden light of the healing presence here also. And I'm curious what arises for you with that. And yeah, so
much, obviously.
So much there.
But I love what you've brought forward, Martha, that you've said, and I want to also point it to your audience that's listening and ask them to meditate on what's our prayer for Chiron.
Yeah.
That's an enormous one. Chiron is our guy. You know, he is a representation of the centaur, who's a healer. So ultimately, before you get into the ideas of Chiron being about wounds, think about him in terms of half horse, half human. So he's an integrated consciousness animal figure, right? He's a hybrid creature, and he's integrated animal human, fully integrated, born that way, right? And not only that, but he's been taught by, on the one hand, Apollo, the sun god, the god of healing. He's been taught about everything that say what in modern world would call Western medicine tradition. He's been taught all of that. And then he's wandered around the forest and talked, because he's animal. He's talked to all the plants and the animals and the trees and all things. And the trees and the plants and the animals have taught him healing from nature. And so he's mixed together all these tinctures and things from in his cave from the forest, and he's mixed them together. Not because somebody told him that. Apollo doesn't know that. Only Chiron knows that. Apollo, although he's the god of healing, doesn't know that. Chiron does, right? And Chiron is deeply loved and supported by Chariklo, you know, and who's also a tremendous healing force and the master of holding space, right? But together, they're able to do both. They don't have to separate out the Apollonian world of healing and the nature world of healing. They don't have to. This would be absurd for them to do that. It wouldn't make any sense to do that. And there they are able to teach others, like Asclepius, like Achilles, like Jason from Jason and Argonauts, all these kind of like incredible figures they're able to teach, who are then able to go on and teach, you know? And that's how we get the entire lineage that comes all the way through to today, you know? So there's that. But Chiron, we have to wrestle though with the fact that Chiron is in Eris and has been since April 2018. And so we have to wrestle with the wound. We have to be with what that wound is. And I don't know how much time I've got and whether you want me to go into this.
Oh,
or
no,
not.
no. You take all the time. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'll take a little time with it, because I think it's really important, because I want to be clear that that's who Chiron is first before going into this, because he's often, people get a cursory glance and say, oh, he's the wounded healer, which I get is a profound archetype in itself. But he's not just the wound, he's the healer first, right? And so then we have to ask, how did Chiron get wounded? And I think that is a very, very important thing for Chiron in Aries. And speaking to him right now as he's going retrograde, I want to just be with like, okay, I'm going to take my time with this and not rush it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go backwards through the events mythically.
Totally.
So event number 1 is that Pholus, who's another centaur, has opened a bottle of wine that he really shouldn't have. And it's Dionysian wine. We use the word wine now, but it may be something like incredible ancient ambrosia that even if you have one bit of it, you may even become immortal for all that we know, like that kind of incredibleness. He opens it because Hercules asked him to open it. But he shouldn't even have it. He didn't want to not open it though, because Hercules is like, come on, how often is Hercules around? You know, let's have some wine. He opens it, and from the opening of that, the centaurs out in the forest smell it and start going wild and unruly and crazy and attack because they really want this ambrosia. They can smell it. They know how good it is, and they just attack. In that attack, Hercules takes up his bow and arrow. Now, Chiron also, we know, was taught warcraft, so also is handy with the bow and arrow and everything. So they're trying to fight back against this wild unruliness of these forces of nature that are the wild centaurs. And in that fight, by accident, one of Hercules' arrows hits Chiron in the leg. You can imagine it wherever you want to imagine it. I'm right now imagining it in the thigh, which for the Fisher King wound, who's several thousand years later, is like a symbol of a injury of the libido, an injury of one's sexuality, creativity, all of that kind of stuff. He's injured there. And it's not just any arrow. It's an arrow dropped. What am I looking for there? Dipped in the blood of the Hydra or the Hydra. And so it's extremely venomous and poisonous. And it should have killed Chiron, but he's half immortal. So he doesn't die, but he's half mortal. So he's deeply wounded. So here's Chiron as a figure. The animal and the consciousness is one of his integrated parts. And the immortal and the mortal are another one of his integrated parts. And in this wound from the arrow, all of it sort of splits out and he becomes split. So his consciousness and his animal are split. Go back to Descartes to read a bit more about that and, get a sense of like the mind-body split stuff. And his mortal and his immortal are split from each other. Look at the history of the last couple of thousand years, how we have to go through a priest in order to get in touch with the divine, and because we're split, right? So now you talk about oneness, but we've just experienced in the mythology the splitting away of 4 different things: the animal, the consciousness, the mortal, the immortal. And that's the deep wound, right? And to get to, and now what's really trippy is if you keep going back, you can get a lot about the state of the masculine right now and what it needs. But I want to take a pause here and just say, like, as you're listening to this story, right now emerging, we're talking about your experience with the divine masculine, and we're talking about, your own Chiron, Venus, South Node, Eris stuff. What does it hit for you? Or the question would be, where does the arrow hit?
Well, and I will name also my Chiron is at 28 Aries. So the North Node is coming almost exactly on my Chiron right now, and Pluto is squaring my Chiron. So,
that's a lot. Yeah.
Just FYI.
Yeah, just FYI.
Yeah. So where does it hit? I think, yeah, it's a lot of different layers there, but and I think this is my 4th pass of Pluto squaring my Chiron. So I feel like I've kind of integrated a lot of my own journey with this Pluto thing that I've had going on. But one question one grief that arises in my heart as you're talking is this question that did arise also in the symposium, and I feel like didn't quite get answered. A lot of people, women in particular, felt like it didn't get answered, and I felt like I would still love an answer. And I'm not, and you can answer this question if you want, but I'll just say this is what's arising in me as you're asking me, is this question of what can I do, right? Like what can I do as a being of this planet, and also as a woman, both as a being who is both masculine and feminine, and as a being who really is feminine.
Right.
what can I do to help? That's kind of where I feel a little bit at a loss, and I feel
Yeah.
really sad.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I did everything I possibly could to hold a truly healing space. And I think I did it. Like, I don't think I did anything wrong. And I think I met my charge. I met what I was asked to do, for sure, to
Yeah.
a pretty much of an nth degree. And there's still all this wounding in myself, in the world, and all of it. And there's so much polarity still happening, right? So I know I'm not the only solution to the world's problems, but I think that I feel like on a certain layer pretty exhausted
Mm.
and sad.
Yeah.
And then but I'm also still committed to the healing.
Yeah.
And I have Chiron on my south node. And I have Hygeia on my ascendant and my moon. Like,
Yeah.
I'm definitely here as a healer, but with the wound, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. And I think a lot of women, I can just speak as a woman, have this question: if we're dedicated to not polarizing, we're dedicated to not just continuing the wounding, what can we do for the masculine? One answer that arises for me is to be the Chariklo, but I also don't want to polarize myself into the Chariklo either, right? Like, so I want to be
No,
Chiron
don't want
and
that
Chariklo at
position.
the same. Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to be both. I want to be all of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that's what I would say.
Yeah. It's a one that we go to, isn't it? Because we want to, I'll just say this actually, because it comes up. We want to get out of it.
Mm. I don't want to be hurting right. We don't want to be hurting.
Yeah, we don't want to,
Yeah.
we want to get out of it. And what I found, end of last year, I did a 10-day Vipassana, and, we're meant to be not really using our imaginations in a process like that, which is very Shiva-like. Just to state that I did use my imagination. And when I was in a really still place, I asked the question, where does the arrow hit? Where does Chiron's arrow hit me? And then Chiron was standing right there and showed me exactly where it had hit. And then my job was, because arrows injure and arrows point, right? And so then my job was to follow the arrow in.
Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah. So Chiron doesn't represent a fix or doing anything. He represents going in. And that's what Asclepius also represents, because Asclepius goes down, down, down into the dreams, into the dream chamber, into our fears. There's snakes all around. And we sleep there on that slab in the Abaton, in the deepest dream chamber. And we address it there, which is the root level. So the real issue is in our dreaming. That's the real issue. And we've got to go down there and see where it is. And if you follow your individual arrow, you'll find the collective wound.
Oh, wow.
That's what I discovered when I broke the rules of Vipassana by using my imagination and asking Chiron to show me. And show me, he did. Trust me. It was like, this arrow. And then I saw the 50,000 ways that, let's call it the 10,000 ways that I am avoiding going there. And each of those ways that I craftily, cleverly avoid it, just amplifies it. And there's only one arrow. So I just need to follow that in. There's just this wound, follow that in. And that's through the body, and it's through imagery, and it's through the dreams. And you can get down and you can go, oh yeah, okay, just sit with it a little bit longer, linger in the wounding of it all. But then you can find your way by following that arrow, and then things can clear up. And then things start to change because the dreaming changes. And I just don't know if there's another, like every other solution feels a bit like the Hydra story, which is, so remember, how did he get injured? Well, because Hercules was originally battling, most people probably know it as the Hydra, so let's go Hydra. In battling the Hydra, every head that he cut off with his trusty club, 2 more came up in their place. And that is the state of us.
Yes.
It's like, I see the problem. It's toxic men. Let's make lots more feminine figures in all of the stories that we tell, and let's make them flawless, because that'll balance that out. Boom, all these other heads are immediately, not in another time, like immediately start to grow out. Okay, well, now there's more problems. We've got like incels, and we've got like guys that are, we've got the suicide rate of men at 3, something like for every 3 men, only 1 woman will commit suicide.
Yeah.
So men are not looking great. Well, how should we deal with that? We should make them more nice and kind. Okay. All these new heads come up, right? Because it's that blood. It's the blood of that figure, that monster that wounds Chiron. Remember that. It's the blood of that one that wounds him. It's that level of solution doesn't touch this problem. Doesn't touch this problem. The problem is that there is a wound, and we need to address it. And we need to tell better stories, and we need to restore masculinity, even in its old school forms in some ways, back to a place where it's like, actually, there's pride there, there's beauty there. We want men in the world. I'm not a like that style of man, but I can appreciate that style of man, that more sort of like classically masculine thing. I can actually appreciate that. I like that there's men like that. I like that there's men like me, and I like that there's men that are like fully feminine in the world. That all works for me.
Yeah.
In the same way, like I can really appreciate, and the Greek mythology's taught me this, like I can appreciate Artemis style women or Athena style women. They're fucking badass. Sorry to swear on your show.
No, go for it.
But they're badass, right? Athena's the goddess of war and wisdom. War and wisdom. She's born straight from Zeus's head, fully armored with a sword. She wants nothing to do with men for her whole life. I appreciate it, right? Artemis is the ultimate huntress. She's the goddess of the wild beasts. I appreciate it. Aphrodite is sensual and sexual and expressive, and like goes after what she wants. I appreciate that. So I can appreciate those 3 things in the men and the women and the others that I see. I can appreciate that. Why not? Right. So that helps me out of the rigidity, but it doesn't send me into the Piscean soup of that it's all like this souped out oneness where everyone's everything. I'm not that interested in that, actually. I'm interested in specifically being who I am, and others doing the same, because that's how we recreate a more beautiful world.
Aquarius.
So they're going to meet. They're going to finally meet in that Aquarian thing, which can be very idealistic, I know. But hey, we got to start with an ideal. Actually, recovering some ideals might be really good for us.
Beautiful. Did you have more of that story you wanted to tell, or was that...
I mean, there is more, right? But that feels like a good amount of it to tell. And I sit in that story of the battle with the Hydra a lot, because it has such consequences, and it comes from such consequences. So it's a very pivotal moment, and I don't think it really gets resolved within the myth itself. And I love that about it. It doesn't tell me what to do. It just tells me what doesn't work, which is like using my club to smash the heads off.
Yeah.
That's not going to work.
So again, speaking for many women who have spoken to me and myself.
Yeah, please.
Do you have an answer for yourself, even on a personal level, of what can we do? Like what, and you don't have to speak for all men here, as you can speak just for yourself or whatever feels right, but what do you want from the feminine? From, again, that's very broad, I get that, but those of us who we feel deep grief. Okay, here, I'll give you the narrative that a lot of women like me, including myself, have right now. Essentially, it's that people of all genders are very traumatized, hurt, etc., in various ways, and there's this sense that women and the feminine has been pretty supported since the 70s ish, with the rise of feminism and, you know, second wave feminism and then third wave. You know, there's been a lot of this, lots of beautiful support around healing of the feminine, etc. Okay. Beautiful. And I hold my own goddess series, right? So I'm all for that. That's beautiful and wonderful. And then it feels like there has been less support for the masculine in a sense. And so in the 90s, when I was in college, or the late 90s, because I'm 2 years older than you, so same basic trajectory that we had there. Yeah. I mean, when I was in college, you know, I shaved my head and decided I was going to be a lesbian separatist, which is not just a lesbian, but like, I'm never going to talk to men again, ever. And
Artemis.
Totally. Yes. And, you know, really looking back on it, I just laugh. It's hilarious. Because then I went ahead and married a man.
There you go. Yeah.
It lasted like a month. My 19-year-old self. But yeah, I realized pretty quickly I wasn't lesbian. So and then I had 2 kids. One of them identified as a boy. So I'm glad I didn't stay that course. But I get it. Like, I understand that version of the polarity of, you know, the anger and the rage and etc. Okay. The trauma, the hurt. I totally get it. Many, you know, 2.5 decades later, I'm in a really different place. And I'm here holding the symposium on rebecoming the one, right? So it's like, I feel like my journey has been about going to the polarity and then really consciously trying to be holding all of it at the same time. So, so for women like me in that similar position where we get it, like, yes, we acknowledge the hurt for women, we acknowledge the hurt though also for men, and we acknowledge the hurt for people of all genders. Okay. And I feel relatively supported in myself, in my own femininity. So I feel grounded. Okay, speaking for myself, I feel grounded. I feel centered. I feel this like massive amount of divine love and compassion that just moves through me, through my body. Because I've done a lot of my own coming into my own relationship with what I would call the dark feminine in particular. So again, my Venus in Aries on my South Node in my 8th house is like, you know, that's, but to me, that dark feminine energy is just the massive, powerful love of existence. That's what wants to move through me basically all the time. So then I come into contact in various ways and, you know, various kinds of relationship with men who are hurting. It's like I've hurt too. And I feel love. I just want to love them, right? That whether it's a lover, whether it's a friend, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a whatever, that's my true desire. And then I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah. So what comes up for me is like, well, how did the Hydra come to be? Well, Hera is the counterpart to Heracles, who's Hercules. So here's the dilemma for the Herculean. And I think that the injury or the thing that men, I'm going to just say it that way, whatever might happen to me, that men feel a Herculean wound, which is, let me try to articulate this wound. Hercules wants to get out of the mother relationship because it's too devouring and limiting, and he needs to act out his thing in the world, and that's amazing. Everybody loves Hercules, and he needs to get out of the mother thing in order to do that. But because his mother figure, Hera, hates him,
Oh.
just for his existence. He's hated because he's the son of one of Zeus's many affairs. So he's hated in the womb. He's hated in his conception, right? So he comes in the world and Hera sends 2 snakes to try to kill him, right? That's her first move. That's all he knows of love. So what does he want? To escape the mother and to be loved by the mother at the same time, which puts a real dilemma out there, because this is what we call the mother complex, that he ultimately wants to escape the mother and meet the mother in the same breath. That's the complex. Now, if you are to give the mothering side, he'll try to escape it because he's trained primitively to escape it. It's not even a choice. Needs to escape. That's what Jung called the individuation process. Jung, with the sun in Leo, his own individuation process, also part of that, right? Really spoke to it. The need to escape the mother's world and go out into the world and make something of oneself. Now, what kind of energy is that really looking for? It's not the mother, but it seems like it wants the mother. And so when you're caught in that yourself, your own mother instinct kicks in. I'll mother and I'll make it better by being the mother. But that's exactly the kind of energy that he's trying to escape. Doesn't give the answer, but it gives the dilemma, you know, because your mother will be pulled forward into that relationship. And when mothers pull forward, well, he needs to get away from mother. And now, yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, my moon happens to be on my ascendant, FYI, too.
Well, there you go. So that's the draw.
No.
And if people can resonate with that and feel like, oh yeah, so what do we do? Well, what do we do? I don't know. But if we could rescue, going back to the earlier point, if we could rescue Mars and rescue Venus out of their exiles, there's nothing to do with mother or father in that, or any of that. They just are attracted to each other and they go for it. That's what they do. And I think that with both Mars and Venus, or Eris and Aphrodite being in exile, well, if we could pull them out of exile, if we could find our way back to that, then we're back in like healthy adult relating kind of structures, because that getting those back, that they're essential for all of this. Now, so that comes to part 2 of my answer, I think, is that we're not going to bring Mars back by making it Venus. So we're not going to we need Mars to be Mars and Venus to be Venus. And when Venus tries to make Mars Venus, she'll either succeed and not be attracted to Mars anymore because he's no longer Mars, or fail and feel rejected by Mars. Actually, in the myths, Aphrodite loved Eris exactly as he was, and he was a total warmonger. She didn't really care. So this is that's really that gets down to a thing, right? Because Venus is about love and Mars is about war. And so one of the things we might have in our collective consciousness is like, the world will be a better place if we can be done with war, if we can just get rid of it off the planet. And it's like, yeah, I get that. I mean, there's songs about that from the 60s, right? And that go all the way through. And I get it. I get where that comes from. Where that comes into reality, though, is that Mars feels like, oh, you don't want me? I'll go into exile. What happens in exile? Way more war. Way more war. So the Eris piece of this ends up coming back around again. So part 1 of it is like, how to work with the complexity of the mother complex, and part 2, how to let Mars actually just be Mars, and let Mars have its own stories and its own mythology, and try to sort of like intrude upon that and say like, no, what would be better is if men are like this. Men see through that. They don't like it. And it makes them feel real depressed about being a man.
Yeah. And when you're saying all that, I think of my own Mars, which happens to be in Aquarius.
There you go.
I know. I know. Yeah. So it's like I feel myself just drop into myself, like rather than thinking about what can I do for you.
Yeah.
It's like more like my instinct is to drop into my own Mars story. Like,
what can I do for this part of me that's being represented in this dynamic? Now that's a different question, isn't it? Because then maybe you're able to kind of like not get caught in the complexity of it all and sort of stay. And then when you stay, something unravels and something kind of almost works itself out magically on its own. And you're sort of staying with the part that, like, oh my God, I'm so compelled here to go into mother mode or to Venusianize this person or kind of that kind of a thing. So, this isn't a solution that's like, so then do this. No, it's not like that. But as you just did there's something about dropping into like, it appears like this complexity is out there in the world and in this dynamic. I wonder what would change if I actually got into where this is inside of me, because as you say, we are all the one. We're never not the one. So the thing that's happening out there is also happening inside of me. Can I drop into that and stay with that long enough? And then maybe something starts to shift out there. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it does, but I found in my life that it starts to. Something happens. Something different happens because I addressed it closer to the root.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And that's a whole other conversation that could take another 5 hours. But yes, in my own relationship, my own inner feminine and masculine, absolutely things have shifted drastically over the last few years, and both first internally and then what would manifest outside was, uncannily a mirror.
Uncannily. Yeah.
I mean,
and that's
really.
when we start to really adjust our sense of what reality is. And then from there we can do some deeper dreaming.
Super beautiful.
I don't know if I answered all the questions, but maybe raised some more.
I think, probably to be continued here. So in different forms. I don't know.
Yeah. I'd like that.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say what I can say is that asking the questions and refining the questions and bouncing them around is something that you can do for this, as you are doing, so I don't want to say it's something you can do. It's something that you are doing, and it's beautiful, and it is something that I'm sure is helping, even if the stuff that comes up for people is really uncomfortable or it doesn't go according to plan. That's also kind of cool in its own way. And maybe it's just my Mars and Gemini speaking to that, but continuing to be curious certainly has helped me. Yeah.
Wonderful. One last thing. One more last thing.
Yeah.
I know that you just went to Greece, and I haven't heard about your trip at all, actually. I know you're intending to be visiting some of these sacred temples.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's something that arises in you, and it's totally fine if not, around any of that you feel like might be a healing thing to insert here before we close. Is there, you were talking about us needing ways, or needing to be able to have sacred relationship to these archetypes. And I'm just wondering if there was some experience or anything that comes to mind about what you experienced there.
Well, what springs to mind, and I apologize if I'm in Bali and sometimes there's some noises, so something's happening in the village.
I'm not hearing
so
anything.
That might come through. Okay. One of the great highlights that I was hoping would meet my expectations, and then it exceeded them, was going to Epidaurus. And that was the main sort of temple of Asclepius from the ancient world. And a lot of that, just the remains are really kind of well kept. And a beautiful thing happened because my mentor, his name is Brian Clark, he told me that when you go to this place, you'll enter at a certain place. Just don't even look at anything. Go all the way to the end and start there. He's like, just go to the end and start there. Start with a meditation at the beginning. And my partner and I did that, and there was no one back there. It was amazing. And basically that's where the pilgrims would come. So people looking for healing would go on often multiple day treks and things just to get to Epidaurus. And then they would be met at the entrance, but not able to really enter just yet. And the priests and the priestesses of the Asclepian tradition would meet you and put you through a purification ritual. Now, these places were always built on sacred springs, and there were hot and cold thermal springs and things like that. I mean, it was incredible, right? So you just take as long as it takes until you're ready and you've left your world behind and you're ready to enter the sacred space. There's all, like sleeping quarters and everything. And so there's space for you. You just have to wait. And it'll take until it's kind of understood that you're ready and you've left behind everything in your world in order to enter. So we meditated into that as pilgrims ourselves and just kind of felt the truth of where we were sitting. It was actually a lot of trees around. It almost felt forest-like, which is really unusual in Greece. Most of these sites are quite dry. Greece is quite a dry country. This was like pine trees and things. It was amazing, birds, and it just felt like you were in nature, really embedded. And then you make your journey. And as you make your journey along, you're sort of seeing this temple is to Hestia, and this temple is to Hera, and this temple is to these gods and goddesses, right? And then right in the middle of it all, there's two things. One is a labyrinth going down that people would go through this labyrinth kind of structure to get down into. It's like a visiting the underworld experience that was over there. And then the main part of the temple was the Asclepian Abaton or dream chamber. And we were able to actually go in there and have a lie down on this slab in the Abaton with no one coming in, have a little nap there. And that's how it would work, is that you would, once you were ready to enter, you would basically, there'd be non-venomous snakes and you go past those and then lie on a slab and then take in the dreaming. And in your dreaming, Asclepius or his animals, which are dogs or snakes, would enter your dream and either perform the healing there or show you what you needed to do in order to heal. And that was, I had prayed that it would meet what I wanted it to be in a way, because I had a high expectation and it really felt like somewhere very, very special. And so this place just is there. It's evidence of an entire tradition of the sort of healing that really leans in to the nature of the psyche, which is again back to the dreams, and embedded in nature with the sacred springs, with the hot and cold thermal baths, with priests and priestesses willing to take you through the whole purification ritual and get you ready. And on the totally other side of this thing is an enormous amphitheater. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, where they would play out theater. And there's an Olympic-sized stadium where they would show off, like, here's what it looks like to be super healthy. So when we're talking about holistic or holism, this place is holism, right? Because it understands that theater and story is part of healing, right? Telling a good story and acting it out is part of healing. And also, performing and showing the feats of what it is to be uber healthy is part of healing too. And the purification ritual is part of healing. And all these gods and goddesses that are also acknowledged is a part of healing. So my trip to Greece had multiple parts that were incredible. But Epidaurus was definitely one of them. And the other major one was Delphi, where the oracle was, the Pythia or the Pythia, who wielded enormous power with everything that she would say in the ancient world as well. So it helped me just to orient to this, not that long ago, a couple of thousand years is a real blip. And we've gone a long way away from that style of living in communion with each other and nature. That's what I see it as. And yeah, it was profound. I'm still integrating it all.
Yeah. I can feel so many layers in it, in my
Yeah.
describing it as, wow. I feel like it's waking back up all kinds of layers in myself.
Because they're there, those layers. That's how I feel too. There's like multiple cellular memories available just by remembering this stuff.
Yeah.
And it never has to be as opposed to Western medicine or something like that. Like it's not an as opposed to, it's just like connecting to your roots is never as opposed to, right? Like you're actually connecting to something ancient that was really valid and valuable. That somewhere along the line, there was a decision in the collective that it wasn't valid and valuable anymore for whatever reason. But it never stopped being valid and valuable. And I think yeah, my prayer to Chiron, that was one of the questions, would be like, how do we find our way back? How do we find our way back to that? Where there's room, there's plenty of room here for all sorts of expression, but within that room is like classically masculine things, classically feminine things, but then understanding that in terms of like Apollo style masculinity, Dionysian style masculinity, even Asclepian style masculinity or Chiron style masculinity and Mars Eris style masculinity. Like let that be multiple things. So people that are naturally drawn to the Mars type can go there and do the hero trip. People are entertained by that. We like it. And then on the feminine side, like the Aphroditic, the Hera, the Artemis, the Athena, like letting that be also so many very specific styles of femininity. We probably wouldn't associate war and chastity with femininity, but Athena, who Athens is named after, right, was
Warrioress.
Yeah, the warrioress. That's a form of femininity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think just a broader conversation around it without getting lost in it, because I know that that's a risk as well. So we have to start where we are and move our way out of it. But I don't think the solution is just to be done with it all and to put it all back in the ocean.
Right. Well, again, the books that I'm supposed to be channeling, Love Speaks, The Goddesses Speak, and The Gods Speak. In The Goddesses Speak, it starts out by talking about the infinite petals of the flower of the divine feminine, right?
Right.
I'm going to guess that The Gods Speak will be very similar.
Well, why is it that it's so weird to think about like a goddess circle? I live in Ubud, so those happen all the time, but not a god circle. Why is it that the god circle feels like, oh, that's macho and misogynistic? It's like, why? You don't think that the goddess circle is misandrous, which is a word that means hating men. We don't even have misandry as a word in the collective. We have misogyny and we have misanthropy, which is hating all humans, but not misandry. I sense a little bit of misandry around. Yeah. I think it's a valid enough word.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. I feel like I've said a lot.
Yeah. Well, no, it's, I mean, so good, so beautiful, and so perfect. Just wow.
Yeah, it feels like Chiron in his process of going retrograde was hanging with us.
Literally what I was just about to say. I'm just feeling Chiron sitting right here.
Yeah.
That's what's that. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. And if there's one sort of takeaway, I'd say like follow that arrow. It was extremely, extremely helpful to me in my inner process when I stopped trying to get away from the pain and actually saw that there's a specific arrow to what's the most painful thing inside of myself, in my body. Like the arrow is still there. And if I can follow it, I can get to the heart of things a lot easier.
Yeah. And then I feel like I want to add to that, you know, as the North Node is traveling toward Eris and then Chiron, I
Yeah.
mean, it feels almost like the arrow going deeper, deeper, deeper,
Yeah,
right?
well said. Definitely. Yeah, because there's so many arrows. Like Eros has arrows, and Apollo and Artemis both have arrows.
Mm.
Artemis has this silver arrow that she brings to bring a swift and painless death to older women
Oh, wow.
when they're like at the end.
Mm.
Isn't that powerful? I
That's
just read
Artemis?
this the other day. That's Artemis. She has the
Mm.
silver arrows of the moon, right? Whereas the golden arrows are Apollos of the sun.
Mm.
And she'll bring that swift and painless ending to someone's story.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And so, as someone with a grandmother who's about to turn 105, that story particularly met me. Yeah. In the pain of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But
And then,
anyway, that
yeah.
opens up a whole different conversation.
Yeah. It's like, how many conversations could this be? And I'll
Yeah.
just say, as Venus has gone retrograde today, it's opposite the asteroid Eros.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah.
So they're all
Her
here
own
with
son.
us.
Her own
What'd you say?
son. Yeah.
What did you say?
Her son.
Oh, her son.
Yeah.
Mm.
Eros.
Mm.
Eros and Aphrodite are the two fish of Pisces, in fact. That's Aphrodite and Eros, aka Venus and Cupid,
Oh,
connected to each other and swimming down it through the waters.
okay. Yet another whole
Put
story.
that doorway over there. We'll get that later.
Oh, wow. Yes. Okay. So
Yeah.
beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really enjoyable.
Would you like to name anything about you, your work? I didn't even tell people anything about
That's totally fine.
you.
Yeah, no, if you want to find out about me, I have a podcast called On the Soul's Terms podcast, and everything else I do is on thesoulsterms.com. And I'm just in the process of cooking things up and moving into more teaching and things, but that's all happening. I do one-to-one sessions, and but yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a watch this space. Things are moving in a certain direction for me, and I'm looking forward to bringing in a really mythically grounded sense of astrology. And I feel in that way like I'm part of a lineage, and finding Brian Clark has been huge on that. Melanie Reinhardt's been a mentor for all of my astrological life, and people like Jason Holly are also in that realm, and I'm just like, wandering around in there going like, oh, do people want to hear this stuff? I hope so. So I'm just going to keep speaking about it, and we'll find out.
Yeah. And I'll just add in. So yes, so Chris's podcast is incredibly beautiful. I highly recommend it. I mean, go and see. Number two, yes, you were highly recommended to me by Melanie Reinhardt. I say more about you formally in the other interview I did with you, which is in the symposium, but also people can just find it. It's public now on my YouTube channel. And you are both an astrologer and a psychotherapist, and actually also craniosacral therapist, right? And
yeah,
you have this similar, and I'm also an astrologer, a psychotherapist, and a body worker, and craniosacral I mean, all of those too.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, the work you do from my perspective is deeply beautiful, deeply needed, really healing. Again, I feel that golden healing light here, and
Mm.
That's a reflection of you. So thank you for existing.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing, and for reaching out, and for trusting those hits as
Mhm.
well. And yeah, just keep it up.
Mm, same.
Keep going. Yeah. Yeah.
Wonderful. And yeah, people watching, please, comment and share with us your thoughts. We would love for you to be
Would
part of
love
this.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would love to see where the conversation goes, and what happens for people when they're listening.
absolutely.
Yeah,
To be continued.
to be continued.